Hey, we're back at Scuderia Silva. We're working on this 62 Healey tri-car. One of the things that's often overlooked is the steering gear box. We're going to fill that up. There's that big bolt on the top right there. There's some other bolts around it. We're going to fill that up with the recommended fluid, and that I think it's called a fluid grease, and it comes out of England. It's made for these old steering boxes. Works wonderfully. You can kind of see it behind that bolt is a adjustment for the steering box. You can see the slot in the top of the head. We're going to loosen that lock nut, and we'll go through the procedure for centering up the steering, and then we're going to run that lock nut down and do the Healey recommended adjustment to take the slack out of the steering mechanism in that box. We're going to take the oil plug out first. This is where we're going to start putting in the fluid. It's a very small hole. It's a totally inadequate hole, and because the fluid is so thick that it's hard to get the fluid into that box. So what we do is we warm the fluid up by leaving it in water, the correct steering fluid, Penrite steering box lube. So we warm up some water in the microwave. It's so thick, I put it in a ketchup dispenser from a restaurant, and it's so thick that I microwave the water, get it super hot, and let it soak in there, and then I microwave the water. I let it soak for about a half an hour because it's so darn thick, it's very hard to get it into that hole if you don't get it really warm. Putting it right in here and just shoving that juice right into the gearbox here. When you get to a certain point, it thinks it's full, so we take the steering wheel, run it all the way left, all the way right. I do it 2 times, left, right. And it still thought it was full. The specification is for the box to be full. And so I just take a little piece of cut-off wire, and if you stuff that piece of cut-off wire in here and shove it down, what you find out is it thinks it's full, it's still not full. And so that's why a lot of these cars get very loose steering boxes, is over the years nobody ever did this. And you can't buy these steering boxes, so there's a lot of Healeys running around that are very loose. We're going to start manufacturing a box, but it's going to be expensive by the time it's done, and a little, it takes some grease. Now I have the radiator out, so this is a lot easier, but even with the radiator in here, you can get your arm in here and service that, get this thing greased up properly. I'm going to continue to grease it up, and then we'll go over the adjustment on the centering device there. Wanted to get the steering box serviced. Well, we had the radiator out of the car, so we've been going over that as we speak, and there's the little plug hole in the top of the steering box, and so we fill this up until this is actually full. We used a lot of grease in this example, and that's part of the reason the steering in this car was so shady. The tie rod ends also were replaced, and I serviced some other major components, put the bushings in the front and all that kind of situation. So now what we're going to do is we want to test and make sure that we've got enough fluid in that steering box. Normally there's not enough fluid in the steering box. That leads us to all these steering issues and wearing the service unit out. When you measure these, after you think you've got it in there, we already talked about poking the wire in there. We've already done that. And so, but the real test at the end to make sure that you're topped off, and these never are. I'll guarantee you. You think you're topped off, you're not topped off. We put our little piece of wire in there to make sure the air pockets got out of there. We've been turning the wheel. We probably turned the wheels back and forth in 2 sets of 2, maybe, a couple times, 3 times. And as we're filling it up, so that we're driving the worm gear around and using that oil up and shoving it around inside that box. So now it's time to measure it. So the important part here, if you have the steering box cranked all the way to the right, as if you're turning right, the worm gear will be plugging off the hole. Here's our snap-on screwdriver that we're going to use as a measuring stick. And I've had this for many years. And if you put it in here now, we'll see that we can't even get past the air induction tube without getting stopped. And that's because the part of the worm gear there is in front of the hole. And keep in mind, so we're only down about that far. You can see the grease level. So let's look at what happens when I turn the steering wheel all the way as if we're turning a left-hand turn. Round and round we go. There we are with the left-hand stop. And now when we use my little snap-on short screwdriver, we see that it goes all the way in the hole from the handle all the way into the hole there. See? That's the correct way to check your depth. And as we come out of there, we can see by looking on the stick that we're completely full. Okay, now that takes care of this side. We're going to plug this side up now. We're going to put the plug in. Of course, when we put the plug in or when we take a plug out, take a minute, respect the car, and clean the gasket and clean the plug off inside and out. Take a little time. It just takes a minute. Show some respect for the animal you're trying to fix up here. Clean every part as you're touching it. I don't want to waste these gloves. I got them in a sweet spot right here and I want to finish this. So we're going to just close that. I think that's 11/16 or maybe it's 3/4. I think it's 11/16. We'll clamp that down in a minute. There's another screw behind here, a lock nut. We're going to loosen that. And then we're going to screw in the main screw that goes into that lock nut. So we'll loosen the lock nut. We're going to center the steering wheel first, and then we're going to tighten that according to factory specifications. So we took the nut on the steering box loose, and once we tighten up the fill area here, we loosen this nut back here. It's got a slotted stud in here, and the procedure on that is that you want to have the steering box tight enough that as you're at the center of the position of the steering wheel, when the steering is centered, that you can just barely feel the steering box ease over from center to center. You put the steering wheel in the center position, line up the tires. We'll get out of here. You can see I changed the position of that slotted screw in there. It has now been turned. We tighten that box up just a little bit. This is the opposite side, what we call the idler side of the steering system here. And that center, you see the 3 bolts around the outside of the top housing. That center nut we're going to take out of there, that plug, and we're going to fill that idler with the same fluid that we put in the steering gear box. So we'll take that out here and we're going to follow the same exact procedure and top that idler off. Okay, there we go. We got the steering idler all topped off with the proper fluid. And keep in mind we're using jack stands for safety. We always want to be Mr. Safety, 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 and Mrs. Safety, 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 or Miss, or whatever it is. And be safe. Have a good time. We're done with our steering system apparatus and I'm excited about it.